The air of Kalon Prime was thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and the hum of countless alien voices. Beneath the towering spires that disappeared into the smoky atmosphere, the infamous slave market of Verith Plaza was in full swing. The crowds were a mix of every species imaginable, hulking Shrath brutes with scales glistening in the harsh lights, slender Altrians whose luminescent skin pulsed with excitement, and humans, their grim faces set with the hardened expressions of seasoned warriors. Standing on the auction platform, Illyra, a Nyarian slave, clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. Her people were known for their empathic abilities and elegant, azure-hued skin that seemed to glow in dim light. But today, her skin was hidden under layers of dirt and bruises, her once proud posture forced into a slump by the heavy chains around her wrists. The chains were infused with nerium ore, a rare metal that blocked her empathic powers, ensuring she couldn't manipulate the emotions of her captors. The auctioneer, a grotesque alien with 6 slitted eyes and a voice that rasped like metal scraping against stone, called out bids in a cacophony of languages. The words swirled around Illyra, but she focused on the faces in the crowd, searching for any sign of compassion. She found none. The humans who dominated this corner of the galaxy had turned cruelty into a form of art. Illyra of Nyara, age 24 standard cycles, empathic abilities suppressed, the auctioneer announced, pointing to her with a spindly, clawed finger. Starting bid, 10,000 credits. The crowd surged, voices shouting over one another as the bids rose higher and higher. Illyra's heart pounded, her fear kept tightly in check behind a mask of defiance. She refused to show weakness to the very species that had destroyed her homeworld. 15,000, a hulking human in crimson armor shouted, his voice booming over the din. 17,000, countered a wealthy merchant with a cybernetic eye that zoomed in on her as if calculating her worth. The auctioneer grinned, his needle-like teeth glinting. 20,000 credits. Going once, going twice. Before he could bring his hammer down, a new voice cut through the noise. 50,000 credits. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned to see who had dared to double the highest bid. Illyra strained against her restraints, trying to catch a glimpse of her newest tormentor. Her breath caught when she saw him a human, but unlike the brutish warriors or arrogant merchants who surrounded him. He stood tall and silent at the back of the crowd, a dark cloak draped over his broad shoulders. His eyes, a piercing green, seemed to burn with a cold, calculated intensity. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The weight of his presence alone commanded attention. The auctioneer's grin faltered for a moment before he quickly recovered. Sold. To Commander Cale Thorne of the Human Coalition Fleet. The hammer came down with a final, resounding thud. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Illyra had heard of Cale Thorne, a warrior who had gained notoriety for his ruthless efficiency on the battlefield. The rumors painted him as a cold, calculating killer, a man with no loyalties but to his own ambitions. As he approached the platform, Illyra couldn't help but wonder what dark fate awaited her at his hands. 2 guards roughly yanked her forward, dragging her down the steps toward her new master. She tried to resist, but the nerium-infused cuffs sent jolts of pain through her wrists, sapping her strength. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen had Cale not stepped forward with surprising speed and caught her by the arm. "Easy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. His grip was firm but not painful. "Can you walk?" Illyra glared up at him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I'd rather crawl than be dragged by one of your kind." Cale's lips twitched, not quite a smile but more a flicker of amusement. "Suit yourself," he said, releasing her arm. "But I'd prefer my property intact." Property. The word stung, and Illyra bit down on the retort that threatened to escape her lips. She had learned long ago that defiance only earned her more pain. For now, she would play the obedient slave until she found a way to escape. Cale gestured for her to follow, turning his back as if he had no fear of her trying to attack him. Illyra weighed her options, but knew with the cuffs and guards surrounding them, any attempt would be futile. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward, her feet dragging across the cold, uneven ground. They wound their way through the market, past stalls selling exotic weapons, strange foods, and forbidden technologies. The crowd parted for Kale, who strode with a confidence that seemed to bend the air around him. Elira's mind raced as she tried to understand his intentions. Why would a high-ranking human warrior pay such a fortune for a single slave? What did he want from her? As they approached the loading docks where Kale's starship was docked, he stopped abruptly and turned to her. For a moment, his expression softened, and the intensity in his eyes wavered, replaced by something almost like curiosity. "You're free to speak," he said quietly, his voice so low that only she could hear. "No one here will punish you for it. Tell me, Naarian, what were you thinking up there on that platform?" Elira narrowed her eyes. "I was thinking that if I ever get the chance, I will slit your throat in your sleep." Kale didn't flinch, nor did he seem angry. Instead, he chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Good," he said softly. "I would expect nothing less." Without another word, he led her onto his ship, the Raven's Vow, a sleek, obsidian vessel that hummed with the power of advanced human technology. The moment they were inside, the door sealed shut, cutting off the noise of the chaotic market outside. The interior was surprisingly clean and efficient, with gleaming metal surfaces and dim, cool lighting. Elira braced herself for what would come next, expecting to be thrown into a dark cell or subjected to some cruel interrogation. But instead, Kale removed her cuffs with a simple command to the ship's AI. She stared at him, bewildered, as the heavy restraints clattered to the floor. "You're not a slave here," Kale said, his voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite identify. "At least, not unless you choose to be. You're free to explore the ship, but don't mistake that for freedom. If you try to escape, I will find you. And I can be far less merciful than the warlords who captured your people." Elira rubbed her wrists where the cuffs had dug into her skin, the sensation of freedom both exhilarating and terrifying. "Why," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Why are you doing this?" Kale's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something deep and unspoken behind them. "Let's just say I'm tired of playing by the galaxy's rules," he said. "And maybe, just maybe, I need someone like you to help me change them." Without waiting for her response, he turned and disappeared down a corridor, leaving her standing in the middle of his ship, alone and more confused than ever. As the engines of the Raven's Vow roared to life, lifting them off the surface of Kalon Prime, Elira realized that her life had just been thrown into a new, dangerous orbit. And for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she had long thought extinguished hope. Little did she know, this journey would change not only her fate but the fate of the entire galaxy. The Raven's Vow cut through the cold void of space like a dagger through silk, its sleek hull reflecting the distant light of faraway stars. Inside, the hum of the ship's engines was a constant, almost soothing presence, a lullaby to the emptiness of the universe. But there was no comfort for Elira, who paced the length of her small quarters like a caged animal. It had been days since Commander Kale Thorne had purchased her, and she still couldn't understand his intentions. After freeing her from the narium-infused cuffs, he had treated her not as a slave, but as something else. Not quite an equal, certainly not a friend, but far more than mere property. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was simply a pawn in whatever game he was playing. She had seen glimpses of him during their journey, a tall, imposing figure moving silently through the corridors, his presence both commanding and enigmatic. He hadn't tried to lock her up or confine her movements, but that didn't mean she was truly free. The door to her quarters was unlocked, and yet she hesitated to leave. The ship's AI was vigilant, and Kale himself was always just a few steps ahead, as if anticipating her every move. Finally, the silence became too much to bear. Elira decided to explore the ship, desperate for answers or at least a clue as to what her new master had planned for her. The corridors were dimly lit, casting shadows that danced like specters on the metal walls. She wandered through the empty halls until she found herself standing at the entrance to the command center. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and she stepped inside. Kale was there, seated in the pilot's chair, his eyes fixed on a holographic display of star charts and tactical data. The room was filled with the soft glow of floating projections, casting an ethereal light over his stern features. He didn't acknowledge her presence at first, his focus entirely on the swirling mass of star systems before him. Looking for something, Nyarian? He finally asked without turning around. His voice was calm, almost indifferent, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made her pause. Elira crossed her arms, refusing to be intimidated. Answers, she said bluntly. I want to know why you bought me. What are you planning? And why are you pretending to treat me like I'm anything other than your property? Kale turned his chair to face her, his green eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the hum of the ship the only sound in the room. Finally, he stood and walked over to a control panel, his movements smooth and controlled. You assume I'm like the others, he said, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. That I bought you for the same reasons they buy slaves: to break, to use, to discard. He pressed a button, and the holographic display shifted, showing a map of the Nyarian sector, its systems marked with red alerts. Elira's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her homeworld among the glowing dots. Why do you have that? She demanded, taking a step closer. What are you planning to do to my people? Kale studied her for a moment, then let out a slow sigh. I bought you because I need your help, Elira, he said, the use of her name startling her. Not as a slave, but as an ally. An ally, she scoffed. You expect me to believe that after what your kind did to mine? Kale's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, buried pain. Not all of us are the same, he replied quietly. The human coalition is not a single, unified force. There are factions, warlords, who have turned our people into conquerors, slavers, murderers. I am trying to stop them. Elira couldn't hide her skepticism. And why would a decorated commander of the coalition want to betray his own people? What's in it for you? Kale turned back to the holographic display, his jaw clenched. I have my reasons, he said, his voice colder now. But if you must know, I'm looking for someone who was taken from me by those same warlords. My sister, Lyra. They captured her during an attack on a neutral colony. I believe they've taken her deep into Nyarian space, using her as leverage to force my hand. Elira was taken aback. This was the first time she had seen a crack in his steely facade, the first time he seemed human. But she wasn't ready to trust him. And you think I'm just going to help you? She asked, crossing her arms again. Why should I risk my life for a human? For you? Kale's eyes softened for a moment, and he leaned against the console, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Because you want the same thing I do, he said. Freedom. For yourself, for your people. The only way we're going to get it is by tearing down the warlords who've turned the galaxy into their playground. Elira felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But she quickly buried it beneath her distrust. What's your plan? She asked, more out of curiosity than commitment. Kale tapped a few buttons on the console, bringing up a detailed map of a heavily fortified system. There's a station deep in Nyarian Space Vector Station. It's where they're holding high-value prisoners. If my sources are correct, Lyra is there. But the defenses are too strong for a direct assault. I need someone with knowledge of Nyarian tech to help me infiltrate it. You think I'm just going to walk into one of my people's most secure facilities and help you? Elira shook her head. You're insane. Maybe, Kale admitted, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. But if I'm right, and we succeed, we won't just free my sister. We can free thousands of your people as well: slaves, prisoners, those forced into servitude. Elira studied him, trying to see past the mask of the hardened warrior. She saw no deception, but that didn't mean she could trust him. Yet, the thought of freeing her people, of striking a blow against the humans who had enslaved them, was too tempting to ignore. "I'll help you," she said slowly, "but only because it serves my own goals. The moment this stops benefiting me, I'm gone." Kale nodded, as if he had expected no less. "Fair enough. But know this, once we start down this path, there's no turning back. The Coalition will brand us both as traitors. They'll hunt us to the ends of the galaxy." "Let them try," Alira said, a fierce light igniting in her eyes. "They've taken everything from me already. What more can they do?" Kale's lips curled into a grim smile. "Then let's make them regret ever crossing us." With that, he extended a hand. Alira hesitated, then clasped it, sealing their tenuous alliance. For better or worse, their fates were now intertwined. As the Raven's vow altered its course and shot into hyperspace, heading into the heart of Nyarian territory, they both knew that the battles ahead would test not just their skills, but their very resolve. The galaxy was a cruel, unforgiving place, and they were about to defy it together. The Raven's vow emerged from hyperspace with a jolt, its sleek form slipping into the shadow of a massive asteroid field that surrounded the Vexter system. Here, in the dark reaches of Nyarian space, the Coalition's presence was thin but fiercely defended. Kale Thorne's face was set in grim determination as he scanned the readouts on the ship's control console. Beside him, Alira watched the swirling masses of rock and debris that floated silently in the void. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath. "You think we can just sneak into Vexter Station without getting caught?" Kale glanced at her, his eyes narrowing with a hint of amusement. "I've been called worse," he replied. "But if you have any better ideas, now's the time." Alira gritted her teeth, unwilling to admit that she had none. The station they were headed toward was notorious among her people, a prison and research facility where the Coalition's warlords kept their most valuable captives. According to Kale's intelligence, it was also where his sister, Lyra, was being held. The plan was simple on paper: infiltrate the station, locate Lyra, and get out before the alarm was raised. But as they approached, the station's defenses loomed larger on the holographic display: dozens of automated turrets, patrolling drones, and a fleet of heavily armed fighters. Any mistake would turn the mission into a death trap. Kale turned to Alira, his expression turning serious. "We're approaching the station's sensor perimeter. I need you to access their network and feed it false data so they don't detect our approach." Alira raised an eyebrow. "You want me to hack into one of the most secure systems in the galaxy? I'll need access to a terminal with unrestricted bandwidth." Kale gestured toward the console in front of her. "Already set up for you. Just remember, we only have a narrow window before their patrol ships pick up on any anomalies." Taking a deep breath, Alira's fingers danced over the console, the screen lighting up with streams of alien code. Her people's technology was notoriously complex, but the Coalition had adapted much of it for their own use after conquering Nyarian territories. She had grown up learning the intricacies of these systems, and now she was putting that knowledge to use for a human, no less. As the minutes ticked by, Kale watched her work with a silent intensity. Sweat beaded on Alira's brow as she bypassed firewalls and rerouted security protocols. The challenge of breaking through the Coalition's layers of defenses was exhilarating, almost intoxicating. And yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the fear of failure. One wrong move, and they would be incinerated before they even set foot on the station. "Almost there," she whispered, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the final line of code. A warning beep suddenly blared from the console, and Alira's heart skipped a beat. The station had detected a data breach and was about to sound the alarm. "Damn it," she cursed, fingers flying as she frantically tried to patch the breach. "They're on to us." Kale's jaw clenched, his hands tightening on the control sticks. "How long?" "I just need dash." Alira's voice caught as she forced her way past the last firewall. "Got it. Feeding them a false readout. We're invisible for now. Kale didn't wait for her confirmation. He pushed the ship forward, slipping through the sensor perimeter undetected. The Raven's valve drifted into a maintenance hatch on the far side of the station, hidden from the watchful eyes of patrolling drones. The ship landed with a soft thud, and the cargo bay doors opened to reveal the cold, metallic walls of Vexter Station. Kale and Illyra exchanged a glance. This was at the point of no return. Inside Vexter Station. The interior of Vexter Station was a maze of dimly lit corridors, each one identical to the last, designed to disorient any would-be intruders. Kale led the way, his movements precise and controlled, while Illyra stayed close behind, her heart pounding. The air was cold, and the distant hum of machinery reverberated through the metal walls. "Stay close," Kale whispered, drawing his plasma pistol from its holster. "Security patrols are light in this section, but they'll still shoot on sight." Illyra nodded, clutching the small blaster he had given her earlier. Despite her doubts, she couldn't deny the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She was free, for the first time in years, and she would be damned if she let herself be recaptured. They moved swiftly, evading the occasional patrol and bypassing locked doors with Illyra's hacking skills. As they descended deeper into the station, the atmosphere grew heavier, the temperature dropping with each level. Kale's face was set in grim focus, his thoughts clearly centered on his sister. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, they reached a heavily reinforced door marked with the Coalition's insignia. Kale gestured for Illyra to hack it open, and she quickly went to work. This door was far more heavily encrypted than the others, but with a few deft keystrokes, she managed to disable the locking mechanism. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a sterile, brightly lit chamber beyond. At its center was a single containment pod surrounded by flickering holographic displays. Kale's breath caught in his throat. Lyra. But as he approached, the pod's glass shield lifted, revealing not the delicate features of his sister, but the cold, mocking grin of General Xandros, the Coalition warlord who had betrayed Kale years ago. Well, if it isn't the Coalition's favorite renegade," Xandros sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I knew you'd come running, Commander Thorne. And you brought a Nyarian pet with you. How quaint." Before Kale could react, armed guards flooded the room, weapons aimed at them. Illyra raised her blaster, but Kale held up a hand, signaling her to stand down. They were surrounded. There was no way out. Xandros stepped forward, his cold eyes flicking between Kale and Illyra. "You truly thought you could infiltrate one of my stations without me knowing? I've been watching your every move, Thorne. And now, you've brought me exactly what I wanted." Kale's eyes blazed with fury, but he remained silent, his hands clenched at his sides. Xandros turned his gaze to Illyra, his expression twisted with cruel delight. "You, Nyarian, will help me access your people's archives. Your empathic abilities are the key to unlocking the data we need. Refuse, and I'll make you watch as I break your human friend here, piece by piece." Illyra's heart pounded in her chest, fear and fury swirling within her. She glanced at Kale, who stood tall despite the guns trained on him. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just a mission for him. It was personal. But it was personal for her too. She would not be used again, not by the Coalition or anyone else. Drawing in a deep breath, she squared her shoulders. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it. But only if you let him go." Xandros laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. "Do you take me for a fool? No, you'll do as I say, or I'll put a bullet in his skull right now." Illyra's mind raced. She needed to stall, to think of a way to turn the tables. As she approached the terminal, her eyes flickered to Kale, who gave her a subtle nod. There was still a chance, a slim one, but they had to act fast. As Illyra connected to the system, she began feeding false data into the terminal. Xandros was too busy gloating to notice the silent exchange between her and Kale. But time was running out. If she could trigger a station-wide security override, they might have a chance to escape. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, bypassing firewalls and rerouting power systems. Alarms suddenly blared, and the lights flickered as she initiated a full lockdown. "What are you doing?" Xandros roared, realizing too late what was happening. Kale seized the moment. With a burst of speed, he disarmed the nearest guard, spinning around to take out two more with precise shots. Elira ducked as plasma bolts whizzed past her, diving for cover behind the terminal. The room erupted into chaos, and in the confusion, Kale grabbed Elira's arm. "We need to move, now." Together, they sprinted through the corridors as alarms continued to blare. The entire station was on high alert, but Elira's sabotage had bought them precious time. As they reached the hangar, Kale's voice crackled over the ship's comm Raven's vow, "Prepare for immediate takeoff." The ship roared to life, its engines shaking the hangar as they leapt aboard. With a final blast from the ship's cannons, they broke free from Vector Station's grasp and shot into the safety of hyperspace. As the stars blurred into streaks of light, Elira collapsed into a seat, her chest heaving. Kale turned to her, his eyes filled with both gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "You could have left me back there," he said softly. Elira looked up, her expression hardening. "I told you before, Kale, I am not doing this for you. I'm doing it to destroy them. And now, we're just getting started." Kale nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's finish what we started. Together." The Raven's vow hurtled through hyperspace, its engines humming with barely restrained power. The ship was on a direct course for their next target, the Coalition's Central Command, a heavily fortified stronghold located deep within the Kareth Nebula. Here, the most dangerous warlords gathered, secure in the belief that their secrets were hidden behind a nearly impenetrable defense grid. But after their daring escape from Vector Station, Kale Thorne and Elira were no longer willing to play by the galaxy's rules. In the command center of the ship, Kale studied a holographic projection of their target with grim intensity. Beside him, Elira's fingers flew over the controls, analyzing the station's defense patterns, trying to find a weakness they could exploit. She was exhausted, her body still aching from their escape, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. "We have less than 12 hours before the Coalition realizes what we've done," Kale said, turning to Elira. "Once they figure out we sabotaged Vector Station and stole classified data, they'll send everything they have after us." "Then we'd better make it count," Elira replied, her voice filled with determination. She glanced at the star map, focusing on the flickering red icon that represented their destination. "The intel we took from Xandros' database shows that Central Command is vulnerable during their security shift change. It's a narrow window, but if we time it right, we can get inside undetected." Kale nodded, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You've already risked everything to help me, Elira. I won't blame you if you want to leave after this. Once we're done, you'll be free." Elira shot him a fierce glare, her jaw set. "I didn't come this far to back down now, Kale. I'm seeing this through to the end. My people deserve justice, and I'll burn the entire Coalition to the ground if that's what it takes." Kale's eyes darkened, but there was a glint of admiration there as well. "Then let's finish it together." The descent into the Kareth Nebula. The Kareth Nebula was a swirling vortex of crimson and violet gases, its turbulent storms capable of ripping unprotected ships apart. But the Raven's vow was no ordinary vessel. As they approached the nebula, Elira tapped into the ship's stealth systems, engaging its cloaking shield to hide them from Coalition sensors. "Remember," Kale said as they prepared to breach the nebula's edge, "once we're in, communications will be jammed. We'll be on our own." Elira nodded, checking her blaster and adjusting her combat gear. She was no longer the frightened slave who had stood on the auction block. She was a warrior now, fighting for her people's freedom and for her own. The Raven's vow slipped through the swirling gases like a shadow, bypassing automated turrets and sensor arrays. Elira's fingers danced over the controls, guiding the ship through the narrow pathways that Kale's stolen data had revealed. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, the looming silhouette of the Coalition's central command station came into view, a massive, fortress-like structure built into the heart of the nebula. Kale and Elira exchanged a glance. This was it. Infiltrating the heart of the beast, the docking procedure was swift and silent. As they entered the station through a maintenance hatch, the oppressive weight of their mission settled on their shoulders. They were deep behind enemy lines now, with no backup, no escape plan. But the stakes were too high to turn back. Their objective was twofold. Kale needed to rescue his sister, Lyra, who was reportedly being held in one of the deepest cells. Meanwhile, Elira's goal was to upload a virus into the Coalition's central database, a virus that would expose the Warlord's secret plans to the entire galaxy and destabilize their grip on power. Moving through the station's labyrinthine corridors, they encountered pockets of resistance. Kale's plasma pistol fired with deadly precision, while Elira's quick reflexes and newly acquired combat skills kept them both alive. They worked as a seamless unit, covering each other's backs as they pressed deeper into the stronghold. But as they approached the detention block, their progress was halted by a sudden alarm. Red lights flashed, and the echo of stomping boots filled the air. "We've been compromised," Elira hissed, her heart racing. "How did they find us?" Before Kale could respond, the blast doors slammed shut, sealing them inside a narrow corridor. A harsh, familiar voice crackled through the station's intercom. "General Zandros." Well, Commander Thorne. You didn't think I'd let you waltz into my fortress unchallenged, did you?" Zandros' voice dripped with mockery. "I've been expecting you." Kale's face twisted in fury, but Elira grabbed his arm. "We need to move. He's trying to trap us." Ignoring Zandros' taunts, they rerouted their path, heading for the detention block. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to be slowed down. As they reached the heavily guarded cell, Kale's eyes widened at the sight of a frail figure behind the glass. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice breaking. The young woman inside was pale, her once vibrant eyes dull and lifeless. The guards raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Elira unleashed a burst of energy from a shock grenade she had stolen earlier. The blast incapacitated the guards, allowing Kale to smash the control panel and free his sister. Lyra stumbled forward, her voice a broken whisper. "Kale. I knew you'd come." Kale held her close, his eyes glistening with relief. But there was no time for reunions. "We have to get to the control center," Elira urged. "I need to upload the virus before they lock down the entire station." The final stand. With Lyra in tow, they fought their way to the control center. The Coalition soldiers were relentless, but Kale's fierce determination and Elira's tactical brilliance kept them one step ahead. Finally, they burst into the central command room, where Zandros stood waiting, flanked by a squad of elite soldiers. "End of the line, Thorne," Zandros sneered, leveling his weapon at them. "You thought you could overthrow the Coalition? You're nothing but a fool." Kale stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "Maybe I am. But I'd rather die fighting for freedom than live under your rule." Elira, meanwhile, had slipped unnoticed to the central console. As Zandros monologued, she accessed the station systems and initiated the virus upload. The screens around them flickered, displaying sensitive Coalition secrets, evidence of war crimes, slave trafficking, and corruption at the highest levels. The data began streaming out to every corner of the galaxy. "What have you done?" Zandros roared, turning toward Elira. Kale took advantage of the distraction, lunging forward. The two men grappled, their fists a blur of motion, but Kale's rage fueled him. With a final, brutal strike, he knocked Zandros to the ground. As the virus completed its upload, the entire station shuddered. Explosions rocked the structure as Elira triggered the self-destruct sequence she had secretly programmed. "We have to go," Elira shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm. Kale hoisted his sister onto his shoulder, and together they sprinted back toward the Raven's Vow. The ship's engines roared to life as they blasted away from the disintegrating station. Behind them, the Coalition's fortress erupted in a brilliant explosion, sending shockwaves through the nebula. A new dawn. Back on the Raven's Vow, Kale, Alira, and Lyra stood in the command center, watching the swirling gases of the nebula. The Coalition's secrets were out. The galaxy was in chaos, with factions rising against their former overlords. The balance of power had shifted, and a new era was dawning. Kale turned to Alira, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and relief. "Thanks to you." Alira gave a small, tired smile. "This was just the beginning. The galaxy is still broken, Kale. But now, we have a chance to fix it." He nodded, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then let's make it right. Together." As the Raven's Vow set a course for the next star system, they both knew that their fight was far from over. But for the first time, they faced the unknown not as enemies or reluctant allies, but as partners bound by a shared defiance of a galaxy that had tried to break them. The stars stretched out before them, endless and filled with possibilities. And they were ready to face whatever came next.